everyone. Welcome to the first official lecture for juvenile justice. So I posted a welcome video that you could watch. It sort of explains what the class is going to be about. So this is your first official lecture for the class, and it's going to give you kind of an overview of juvenile justice. So we're not going to start with chapter 1 in the book this week. We're just going to kind of get an overview of the whole juvenile system this week. I posted just one small article that you can read that kind of gives you an overview of the juvenile system, but that's the only reading for this week. So you still have this week to try to get your hands on the textbook, either online or through the bookstore. So let's get started and start talking about some general concepts of dealing with juvenile justice. So you have some basic concepts before we really get started. Okay, so I just have a quote here to really get us thinking about juvenile justice. The way in which a society treats its children, its young people, says something about the future of that society, its beliefs, and the viability of those beliefs. The way in which a society treats those of its children who break its law says something about its humanity, its morality, its resilience, and its capacity for self-correction. So that's just an interesting quote, thinking about the juvenile justice system. We're going to revisit this quote again at the very end of the semester and really assess what we think that our juvenile justice system says about us in our country. Okay, so just to get you thinking about juvenile justice, we're going to start with some terminology. So one of the things you have to understand is that oftentimes the terms in the juvenile justice system are different than the terms used in the criminal justice system. So just because you have all of the terms down in the criminal justice system, you're like, okay, I got all of this. The problem is we change some of those terms when we're talking about juveniles. So I'm going to introduce you to some of those terms today, and then we'll be using those terms throughout the semester. Okay, so just to get you thinking, these are some different terms. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of different terms, and I want you to match them with what they are. Okay, so all the A through M are the terms, and then match them with 1 through 13. So it's a matching exercise, okay? So for example, adjudicated delinquent, what does that equate to on the right side, on the red? Okay, so if it's adjudicated delinquent in the juvenile system, what is it called in the adult system, which is in the red? Okay, so stop the video, do that matching, and see if you can match them up. And then I'll flip the slide and you can see if you got them right. It's just to get you starting to think about how the terms apply. You don't have to know them. If you get them all wrong, it's perfectly fine. It's just to start you thinking about this terminology. Okay? So here are the answers. That is not the answers. Oh, it is the answers. I'm sorry. So this is the correct order that it should have been in. Okay. So an adjudicated delinquent is a conviction. Okay. An adjudication hearing is a trial. Aftercare is parole. A commitment is a sentence to prison. A delinquent act is a crime. A delinquent is a criminal. A detention is confinement to jail. A detention center is jail. A disposition is the sentencing. The disposition hearing is the sentencing hearing. The institution is a prison. A petition is an indictment. And if you take a juvenile into custody in the adult system, that's arrest. Okay, so the left is the juvenile term, the right would have been the side of the adult terms. Okay, so see if you got those right, and if you got them all wrong, no worries. It's just to start getting you to think about the idea that the terms in the juvenile system are different than the terms used in the adult system. So why do you think we use different terminology in the juvenile system than the adult system? Well, Part of that is because we want to treat juveniles different, and we'll talk about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that we do that. But right now, the philosophy is juveniles are different, and we don't want the stigma and the forever effects on their life. So we're going to use different terminology that doesn't hold as much stigma as it would in the adult system. Okay, so if you want to practice those and understand what they mean, I create a little practice assessment in my GCC, so you can go there and you can review those terminologies so you can start to get them formed in your mind so you know the proper terms and what they relate to. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. When we are talking about juvenile justice, we need to first define what is a juvenile. Okay, so it's very important if we're talking about a special system for juveniles, we need to define what is a juvenile. And a juvenile is defined as someone who has not yet reached the age that a state has set forth for adulthood. So if you are a juvenile, you are somebody that is not yet declared an adult in your specific jurisdiction, which is usually the state that sets it. Okay, now New York currently has it set at 18. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. It's called Raise the Age and all the parameters of that. So we'll talk about that throughout the class. But all states are different. All states do not follow the same thing. There's no federal standard that every state has to follow. There's a federal age for juvenile, but each state then can have its own. So there's lots and lots of different decisions on when a person becomes juvenile, depending on the jurisdiction. So if we define a juvenile, then what is the juvenile system, the juvenile justice system? Well, we have a system in the adult system. It's called the criminal justice system for when adults commit a crime and how we seek justice in those cases. So the juvenile system is the legal framework structure that's set up to deal with juveniles that commit crimes. We don't call them crimes in the juvenile system, we call them delinquent acts. So if a juvenile commits a delinquent act, this is the system that is set up to handle those juveniles and what we should do to them to reach justice. Okay, so we'll be going through that and talking more specifically in the next lecture, a quick overview of what are the steps in that juvenile system. Okay, now, why do juveniles have their own system? That's one of the raging debates. We're going to talk about it. It's actually going to be part of your final project, and we're going to talk about at the end of class. Why do they have their own system? Should they have their own system? Or should they be treated like adults? So there are different issues that maybe their brain isn't developed, maybe they haven't reached maturity yet. So that's why they have their own system. And there's a lot of scientific research dealing with the maturity of the brain and the ability to make rational decisions. We also have the idea that if they are young and they have their whole life in front of them, maybe the system should be focused more on rehabilitation. Maybe we shouldn't just be locking them up. So there are a lot of different issues that go along with the juvenile system. Some people argue they shouldn't. They should just totally be treated like adults. And that's one of the concepts we're going to work through as we work through this whole class. Okay, now, when you hear the term juvenile offender, what's the first thing that pops into your mind? So close your eyes and think of the term juvenile offender. What's the first thing that you think of? It could be a lot of different things. So then the question is, are those perceptions affected by the media? Does the media have an effect on how we see juveniles in our system? So these are just some images that you see of juveniles that committed particularly heinous offenses, shootings, mass school shootings, even at super young ages. So we can be affected by the media and how the media portrays juveniles. So we have to be very careful about that. And we have to really dive into the facts of the juvenile system in this class and really see, is the media really portraying juvenile delinquency in an accurate way. And that's another thing we're going to assess throughout the semester. So I'm going to read you a little story, and I want you to really think about this. Okay, so this may affect or help you decide what you think about the juvenile system. So Melvo, it was a Jamaican immigrant who had already spent more than a decade in prison after he and an old man, John Allen Muhammad, older man, John Allen Muhammad, went on a shooting spree in Washington, D.C. in 2002. The shootings took place when Melvo was just a teenager. He was 17 years old, and they appeared to be totally random, and they left 10 people dead. Melvo met Muhammad, a friend of his mother, in Antigua in 1999. The pair immigrated to the United States in 2002, and then they developed this plan on how to shoot and kill random people to create terror within the public. Melvo shoplifted a Bushmaster rifle from a gun store, and he kept practicing his marksmanship in a vacant field. To remain undetected, Muhammad, the man who he did the crimes with, cut a hole in the back of his trunk, and Melvo would lay in the back of the trunk with the rifle, and he would randomly shoot people who had no idea that they were being targeted. The shooting spree lasted 3 weeks, ended when the police found a note left at one of the shootings, and it led them to Muhammad. And like I said, Melvo was 17 years old at the time of the arrest. So my question to you is, what do you think should happen to Melvo? When you hear those facts, what do you think should ultimately happen to Melvo? Do you think he should be treated the same as Muhammad? So Muhammad is an adult male. Melvo was 17. Do you think they should be treated differently, or do you think they should be treated the same? So give it some thought. Now, eventually, Melvo was transferred to adult criminal court, and he was, tried as an adult. And since he was still a juvenile, he was sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Muhammad was found guilty with a capital offense, which means the death penalty, and he actually was executed in Virginia. So they were ultimately treated different. What do you think about that? Now, compare that to another case, John Dean. John Dean was 8 years old when he was publicly executed in England for setting fire to a courtroom in 1629, so a long time before. The judge sentenced him to death, and he sentenced him to death because he said he found evidence that the juvenile at 8 years old had been cunning. He had planned it. It was for revenge. He had a motive, and that there was real malice and hatred when he set the fire. So what do you think about that? Is there a difference between Melvo, who was 17, and John Dean, who's 8? Do you think they should have been treated the way that they were, and that they should have the same sentence? So this is just to really get you thinking about the juvenile system and what should happen to juveniles. Now, when you talk about the origins of the juvenile system, originally it was what was called a one-pot approach. All juveniles and adults were treated the same. So in the John Dean case, they were treated exactly the same, and that's why John Dean received the death penalty. So anybody over the age of 7 was the age that you became an adult. If you were 7, you could form the proper mens rea, and you could be found guilty. You were housed in prisons with adults. You were treated like adults, and you could receive the death penalty like adults. So it was a one-pot approach. Everybody was treated the same. We sort of changed our philosophy on juveniles now. We've moved more to a modern system. And in this modern system, there are 2 concepts that play a significant role in how we see juveniles and how juveniles should be treated. And these are the 2 principles that we use to guide how juveniles are processed in the juvenile justice system. Parens patriae and in loco parentis. So let's talk about those. So parens patriae is the idea that the state has a moral and legal obligation to look after children and the well-being of children. And they have to sort of take on the role of a parent when the parents don't, and when you have delinquent children. So in loco parentis is the idea that the state, if a juvenile commits a delinquent act, the state is going to step in and treat that juvenile as their child in a sense, and they're going to have a moral and legal obligation to look after and treat and take care of and punish that child. So that's really the concept that our juvenile justice system is currently based on. It's based on the idea when a juvenile commits a delinquent act, the state is going to step in and be the parent. So they're going to take them in, they're going to provide them with rehabilitation and education and training and all of the things that are necessary that a parent should be providing. And the whole idea of this is that the state will step in and rehabilitate that child. So the whole juvenile justice system is really based on the idea of rehabilitation and fixing the child. So the question is, do you agree with that? Do you believe that it is the state's duty to step in and rehabilitate and determine what's the best interest of this child to make this child better? Should that be the state's responsibility? Or should we be just solely treating these juveniles like adults and just locking them up and punishing them for the crimes? So right now, that is the current idea of juvenile justice system. We do allow or require these two principles to play a significant role in our juvenile system. Okay, so before I go on, that will be your key word for this lecture, parens patriae. So remember, when you watch this lecture, you have to write that down, and you're going to have to send an email to me with that keyword. So the keyword is parens patriae. Make sure you write that down. Okay, now, when we're talking about, so we have this juvenile system, we do use parens patriae and loco parentis in our system. So if you are juvenile, then you will be treated in juvenile court system. So we have to decide, when does it go to juvenile system? When does the juvenile system have jurisdiction or authority over the juveniles? So there are two times when juvenile justice system takes over, has jurisdiction. Number one, age. So you have to be an age of a juvenile in order to be in the juvenile justice system. And the second thing is that you have to fit into a particular category of child. And we'll spend some time talking about each of these. So you're only going to go to the juvenile system if you're in the proper age and the proper classification of or category of child. So let's talk about this. So the first one is age. So what is the proper age for a juvenile to be first introduced to the juvenile justice system? When is a child old enough to know what they are doing is wrong and hold them accountable for their actions? This is a huge debate. When is a juvenile, and when does the juvenile become an adult? So once we set that age and you become an adult, then you're going to move to the juvenile justice or the criminal justice system. Now, like I said earlier, this differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. It's not the same for every state. So you would have to know the jurisdiction within your state. Now, in New York, we have what's called raise the age. We have recently raised the age of juveniles to 18. So if you're, under 18. So if you are 18, you are now classified as an adult in New York. It used to be 16. So once you were 16, you were declared an adult. Now you have to be 18. So it's a constant debate. What is the proper age to treat somebody as a juvenile? So, think about that. You have to think about factors like, should it be 16 or should it be 18? You can't even vote till you're 18. You can't even drink till you're 21. So if we think you're not old enough to drink, why do we treat you like a juvenile for crimes? Or why do we why are you an adult if it's 16, why are you an adult for crime, but you can't even drink yet? So, or you can't, sign up for the military until you're 18 or different things like that. So you really have to take into consideration all those things. So that was the raise the age debate, and it existed in New York for a long time, and we finally have moved it to 18. Okay, so age. The second thing is category of crime. So children can be classified into different categories depending on what is happening to them. Okay, so we need to go over each of these categories so you understand what each of these categories is. Okay, so we'll talk about each one. So the different categories are status offense, delinquent, undisciplined, dependent, neglected, and abused. So we will move through each of those and talk about each of them. So the first thing we want to talk about is what is a status offender? So a status offender is a juvenile who commits an act that puts them in the juvenile justice system since they are a juvenile, but would not be a crime if it was committed by an adult. So these are delinquent acts for only children, but are not crimes for adults. So what would be some examples? Runaway, truancy, underage possession of alcohol or tobacco. So these are crimes that are only crimes for children or juveniles to commit. They are not crimes for adults, okay? So there's a lot of debate. Should we have separate crimes for juvenile? Is it fair to punish a juvenile for something that an adult wouldn't even be punished for? Okay, and that is actually going to be your discussion for this week, talking about status offenders. Now, what is delinquent? So delinquent is when a juvenile violates a criminal law. So remember, status offenses are not crimes because you can't commit them if you're an adult. Delinquent acts are. These are crimes, but we just call them delinquent acts when committed by juvenile. We don't want the stigma of saying crime or criminal. So we're going to call it delinquent. A delinquent is somebody that commits an adult crime. Okay. Now, would these offenses be classified as status or delinquency? A juvenile breaks a neighbor's window with a baseball bat and the neighbor calls the police. A juvenile burglarizes an empty camp during the summer and the police arrest him on the act. A juvenile 13 runs away from home and the frantic parents notify the police about their missing child. So decide which one would be a status offense and which one would be delinquent. So you can start the video again once you have them done. So hopefully you have delinquent, and status. So those would be the difference between a status offense and a delinquent act. Okay, so those are two categories. Now what's the other categories? What is undisciplined? Undisciplined is a juvenile that can't be controlled by their parents, okay? So if you are undisciplined, your parents are not able to control you. They cannot get you to follow the rules. You're kind of doing what you want, even though they're trying, and they can't control you. That is what we call undisciplined. Now, in New York, are undisciplined, we have a process that can be used for the state to step in loco parentis, and take control of the child since the parent can't. And in New York, we call that PINS, persons in need of supervision. So what happens is the parents would go to a family court and ask for a PINS petition, and they would ask that their child be placed in PINS. And basically, it's like a form of probation for juveniles. They have to show up, they have to be supervised by a juvenile probation officer, and they have rules that they have to follow. And if they don't, then they can be found delinquent. So that is what we call undisciplined. The parents can't control them, and in New York, we use PINS for that. Now, what is dependent? Dependent is a juvenile that has been abandoned by their parents or guardian, okay? So if you are dependent, it means you're dependent on the state. Parentis, parentis, they have to step in. The state has to become your parent, right? In loco parentis. So that is what we call dependent. You have been abandoned by your parents, and the state has to step in and play that role. So then what is neglected? This is a little different because the parents are still involved, but the parents are not providing the basic necessities that juvenile needs. So parents are not providing food, shelter, clothing, education. So the state will step in and sort of take the children away from the parents and sort of take on that parental role because the child has been neglected. And then the last one, what is abused? Abused is a juvenile that is being physically or sexually or emotionally or psychologically or all of them together abused by their parents, okay? So it doesn't have to be just physical or sexual. It can be emotional or psychological. So if the state determines that the parents are abusing their child, again, the state steps in and assumes the role of the parent for that juvenile. So depending on what your classification is, one of these classifications, the state can step in and the juvenile justice system can take a role in that juvenile's life. Okay, so now we're going to do a check and see how well you know your categories. So we have the different categories. Remember, we have status offense, we have delinquent, we have neglected, we have abused, and we have abandoned. So those are your 5 categories. So read each one of these and decide which category it would be. Okay, so stop the video, work through them. When you're done, start the video and see if you got them right. Okay, so the first one would be abused. The second would be undisciplined. The third would be dependent. The fourth would be neglected. And the fifth would be delinquent. And the sixth would be status offense. Okay, so those are your different categories. So hopefully you got all those right. I created another practice assessment. If you think you got any of them wrong, you could practice online. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is what your discussion is going to be, introduction discussion. So there has been a big movement in recent years to deinstitutionalize, so decriminalize status offenses. So there's been a big push that we are sending too many juveniles to the juvenile system. And it's not good. It's not good to get juveniles started in the system at such a young age. So there's been a big push to deinstitutionalize status offenses, take them away. Don't have any juvenile ever go to a controlled sort of institution, a prison, a jail for a status offense. We should be using other methods of rehabilitation for status offenses. So I have posted different resources for you. You should review those resources. You should look them over, and you should actively participate in the first discussion. Remember, with discussions, you need to use terms and concepts from the class. You need to use some of the materials that I posted as support. It can't be solely based on your opinion. You have to integrate concepts that you learned in class to support what you are arguing. You have to have your initial post, and then throughout the week, you have to also comment on 2 other people's posts. So I strongly recommend you do your initial post the first half of the week, and then start commenting on others starting midweek to the end of the week. Okay, so that is posted. That's your first discussion. So we are now done with the very first lecture, substantive lecture on juvenile justice. And the next lecture, we're going to just provide a quick overview of the whole juvenile system. So I will see you soon.